Darshna Soni, you are our communities editor. We're going to talk about immigration and one particular village. What are you going to tell me?
We're going to look at the way that this village represents what's going on nationally. So some of the divisions that we've seen in this village, friends who have fallen out with friends, neighbours no longer talking to each other, all are because of the arrival of around 200 new residents into that village. We're going to look at the impact that it's had and the way this mirrors the debate that's going on nationally about asylum seekers.
Darshna, you've been looking at immigration and in particular how it affects one small village in Leicestershire called Kegworth. I mean, firstly, how did you come across this story and why you wanted to do it?
Well, we were contacted by a number of people who live in the village, and we started getting messages saying this has caused a huge divide in our village. Neighbours have stopped speaking to neighbours, friends have fallen out. And the more we looked into it, we realised that Kegworth actually represents what's going on across the country. So we thought it would be a good place to focus on.
And so, I mean, how did this all come about, this issue of immigration, asylum seekers within this tiny village? Because it all goes down to, well, essentially a deal being done in the hotel there.
Yeah, that's essentially it. We've got a situation in this country where there are a huge number of people waiting for a decision on their asylum claim. So these are people who are applying for refugee status in the UK, but they've been waiting sometimes 6 months, sometimes a year. I've met people who've been waiting 5 years. So there's something like 172,000 people waiting for a decision on their asylum claim. While they wait, the government has an obligation to house them. They have to stay somewhere. So the government started using hotels. Now, it's done this for a number of years, but recently it's really been in the headlines because it turns out there's something like 50,000 people, men, women, children, in hotels, and it's costing the taxpayer around £6 million every single day.
Right now, there's an estimated 51,000 asylum seekers living in temporary accommodation in the UK. That includes hotels and initial accommodation. But how many migrants travel to the UK each year, and where have they travelled from? Well, in 2022, the highest number of asylum applications came from Albania, then Afghanistan, Iran, Iraq and Syria. Ukrainian refugees entering the UK weren't included in the Home Office statistics from last year. About 45% of asylum applications were made by people who had crossed the Channel by small boat. That was a total of nearly 46,000 migrants. Prime Minister Rishi Sunak has said that the government's plan to crack down on small boat crossings was starting to work. He claims that those crossings are down 20% compared to last year. However, most crossings in 2022 took place during the summer months when weather conditions were less dangerous. So it might be too early to know if those crossings really are coming down. And that's also to do with the fact that there's a backlog, right? Which is why we're now seeing more and more people having to be housed in these hotels, and why in the end you end up with a small, quiet village like Kegworth having to have their hotel used for this purpose.
Exactly. So as I mentioned, some people have been waiting 6 months. Once you're waiting more than 6 months, you're officially part of this backlog. And the government is under pressure to try and clear that backlog. But, we've seen cuts to the Home Office. We've seen a fall in the number of caseworkers. There's been lots and lots of reasons why this backlog has built up over the last 10 or so years. While people are waiting, the government does have an obligation to house them. That's why they're ending up placing them in hotels across the country. Sometimes they'll be in a big city. So, for example, I live in Nottingham. Down the road from me, there are a couple of hotels that are being used, but you don't notice because we're a big city. It's an urban area. It's a very diverse, mixed population. So they come and go, they blend in. Somewhere like Kegworth, which is a very small, sleepy village, as one resident described to me, not much around, not a very diverse population, and then you suddenly place 200 mainly young men into that hotel, they're going to stand out a lot more and attract a lot more attention.
And so when do we then first start seeing some sort of reaction or protest from the local community?
Well, the protests started happening pretty immediately, actually, as soon as residents found out what was going on. Yeah, they organised themselves pretty quickly. There was a huge protest outside. It was quite rowdy. One person was arrested. But after that, the villagers started to organise, and they formed a group called Save Our Village. They had hoodies printed. They had the logo printed on the hoodies. They formed a committee. So they were much more organised. And they've been having regular protests outside the hotel ever since. They've also been going to the next village along, which is where Jeremy Pick, the owner of the hotel who I mentioned, he lives locally as well. And they've been marching on his village as well, trying to get his attention.
And so what are their objections? I mean, you say the protest started immediately. Is it because there was no liaising with the community, or is it because they've lost the use of their hotel for several months? What are their objections?
It's a mixture of all these reasons. I mean, I've spent a lot of time in that village, and the arguments that I heard there do reflect the arguments that we are hearing nationally.
It's turning us into racist people, which I don't want to be racist, but it's making me dislike these people. Do you know what I mean?
We don't know anything about these people. We don't know nothing about them, apart from we've just had influx of...
So it's the fact that you weren't consulted?
We weren't told about anything, none of it.
Protect our kids! Terry's not racist!
So some people, for example, told me they're opposed on principle to the issue of immigration. They feel that the country is full, that our NHS, as one woman said to me, is on its knees, that we have a problem with our own homeless people here. So they object in principle to more asylum seekers coming to this country. Others objected to the closure of their facilities. So, the fact that their gym membership was cancelled or somebody's wedding reception was cancelled. There are those kind of objections. Something else that I heard quite a lot was the issue that in that hotel, they are mainly young men and usually aged between 18 to 34. A lot of particularly women in the village said to me that they feel unsafe. They feel as if there are now groups of men walking around, and somehow that makes them feel uncomfortable. I asked them about this and said, have you ever tried going up to them and speaking to them? And they said they didn't want to do that. They didn't feel safe.
But there are those who aren't opposed to the use of the hotel as well.
So we went down there and spent some time there, and we found that there are another group of villagers who have come together and formed a group called Open Arms Kegworth, or OAK. And they've said to me that whatever your politics are, whatever you think of the asylum system and whether these people should be in these hotels or not, the fact is that they are there. We don't know how long they're going to be there. If we look at the backlog and we look at the stats, they could be there for months, even years. So this situation has happened and they've got to make the best of it.
The guys have come from war-torn countries. They want to feel safe and welcomed and contribute to the community.
This populist politics that we've got now, that's what worries me. Everyone's polarised. Nobody talks to each other anymore. And it's Donald Trump politics, isn't it? Why they're chanting save our children? I don't know why they're chanting that. Save them from what?
So some people have started to say, well, how can we integrate these young guys, How can we make them feel part of the village and break down some of those barriers and some of those fear factors? So they've started doing things to help the asylum seekers to integrate. So, for example, they've held English classes. The local bowls club have opened up. So you see some of the asylum seekers going bowling or playing tennis with the villagers. Lots and lots of activities to make them feel welcome. And one woman said to me that it's been a two-way street. It's not just them, saying, here's some raising funds for the asylum seekers or collecting shoes or board games or clothes. They've also learnt a lot from the asylum seekers, and there's been an exchange of different cultures, sharing ideas about food, sharing life stories. And one villager said to me, it's completely changed her life and enriched her life.
I'm learning about their culture, I'm learning different languages. I see their families sometimes virtually or photos, and they've met my baby, and yeah, it's changed my life a lot. It makes you realise how lucky you are.
A lot of words get bandied about when we talk about immigration, stop the boats, economic migrants, etc. But here we're talking about asylum seekers. Can you just explain to me what you know of the individuals in terms of what countries they're coming from, how they've come to the UK, who are living, within Kegworth at the moment?
So the majority of them have come over across the channel on what we call a small boat. It's often no bigger than a dinghy. They have come mainly from countries like Afghanistan, Syria, Eritrea, countries where we know there are a lot of conflicts. And incidentally, countries where something like around 98% of people who apply for asylum are granted asylum. So they're the kind of conflicts that they're fleeing. They do happen to be mostly young men aged between around 18 to 34. And they end up in these hotels. While they're waiting for their asylum claims to be processed, they're not allowed to work, so they can't earn their own money. So they're reliant on the government to provide them with accommodation. They do get their meals provided for them because obviously they're not allowed to earn money. So they do get 3 meals a day. The conditions, I mean, you hear the term, we're staying in a hotel for all these months, and often it's portrayed in the papers as something very swanky. You think of a hotel, you think of room service. They're often very, very basic facilities. You're stuck in a room essentially because you aren't allowed to go out to work. I spoke to one guy who says that, I should always ring him after 11 because he doesn't get up early. He says, I've got nothing to get up for. I've been here for months in this same one room. So it can be quite difficult inside the hotel. Although the government recently tried to suggest that the hotels themselves are what are attracting people to come over. I haven't met an asylum seeker yet who says that one of the reasons he came was so that he gets to stay in one of these places.
Some of those men are really suffering, given not the conditions, given that the hotel is fine, but given, as you say, their day to day and what happens within their life.
Yeah, it's the huge impact on their mental health. And I've spoke to a lot of these young men about what it's like day to day. One of the biggest things that they'll tell you about is their dignity and the fact that they aren't allowed to work. This is a huge issue, especially when we're always hearing at the minute after Brexit, in the current climate that we live in, we've got a huge labour shortage in this country. People who come here and claim asylum aren't allowed to work. They're not allowed to claim benefits. They're given something like an allowance of around £8 a week. And they're relying on charities to provide clothing, to provide activities for them. If there isn't an active refugee group nearby, then often there aren't any activities to do. Luckily in Kegworth, there is this group providing things like English classes, football matches, cricket tournaments. So they have got things to do. But these aren't always every day, and they're not all, and they are charities. So, I met one guy who was really embarrassed because he said he had to get some shirts and a pair of trousers from the charity, and he hated it. He absolutely hated it because he felt that he's now relying on a charity, whereas back home he used to work. He worked in the family business. He's from Syria, and he said before the civil war, before Assad's regime wanted him to sign up for the army, which he didn't want to do, he worked for his family business, so he had never claimed benefits. He'd always provided for his family. And having that taken away can be very, very depressing. And I always find it really interesting when you meet asylum seekers, a lot of them always want to spend a lot of time telling me what they did back home. So they'll tell me about their jobs, they'll tell me all about the positions they held. And you realise after a while it's because they want you to know that they had a career, they had a job, they earned their own money before they came to this country. They don't want you to see them as an asylum seeker.
A lot of them have come over to the UK on small boats across the Channel, which has obviously been a huge story. There's been a big increase. Rishi Sunak has talked about stopping the boats, stopping, what he calls illegal immigration. What do they say about, if you put that to them, to say, you didn't need, or the argument is you don't need to come over across the Channel, that this is illegal, that you shouldn't be doing this. What is their response to that?
The problem is there are very few safe routes to come to this country. So, for example, if you're from Afghanistan, when the Taliban took over that country again 18 months ago, for a while, the British did try and get out people who'd worked as interpreters, who'd worked for the British, whose lives were suddenly under threat from the Taliban. But you'll remember it was a really chaotic withdrawal. There were all sorts of problems with that withdrawal, and it wasn't done for everybody. So a lot of people got left behind. A lot of people are still under threat from the Taliban. You can't just get on a plane and come to England. If you're in Syria, for example, if you're lucky and you end up in a UNHCR camp, if you end up in an official refugee camp and you get chosen for resettlement in the UK, very few people are. If you're lucky, you can come in that way. But there are no other ways that you can come here. If you're in Eritrea, one of the most repressive regimes in the world, how else do you come to this country? You'll remember a couple of years ago, people used to come over on the back of a lorry via Dover. The government have cracked down on that. And so now the boats have become a big thing. That's become a big business in itself. There are people traffickers who will take advantage of you and sell you this crossing. They won't always tell you how dangerous it is, but they will make huge promises to you. So there are very few ways for people to come in. And when I say to them, why did you come this way? A lot of them will say, I had no choice. And I feared for my life. If you were in a war zone, perhaps you would do the same thing.
Is the sense then that, when you hear the sort of the general rhetoric of, people coming over here looking for benefits, looking for money, how do they feel about that? Because do they think that it's rhetoric getting lost in the weeds here, in the sense that some people are getting economic migrants mixed up with, genuine asylum seekers like these people fleeing for their lives?
There is a lot of that. And a lot of the young men that I've spoken to say that they feel people just don't understand why they are here in this country. So people have forgotten about the Taliban, for example. They've forgotten that there's a civil war going on in Syria. They don't know about Eritrea because it is such a secretive regime. You don't hear a lot of news from Eritrea. And people feel that they are all labelled as sponges. I've heard this before. A guy who left Syria said to me, do you honestly think that I would have left my mum and my brothers and sisters and come here just for benefits? No, that's not the case at all. I came here to save my life because I genuinely felt that my life was under threat.
I mean, you've seen some of the consequences, not just in terms of, people's mental health, but also reports of people taking their lives.
Yeah, this has been really sad, actually. We've learned of around 3 deaths just locally in the Kegworth hotel, but also 2 neighbouring hotels. And it's had a huge impact on the community of asylum seekers themselves, obviously their friends, their families, but also people who work to support them. I spoke to a lovely guy called Moshad Ali who works in Kegworth, and he was nearly in tears as he said to me that he really wishes that he could have intervened and helped a young man from Eritrea who had arrived in the Kegworth hotel. Lovely chap, everyone describes what a lovely smile he had. He was known for riding around the village on a bright yellow bike. So you immediately get an image of him in your mind on this yellow bike with a huge smile on his face. He'd become quite withdrawn though in the last few weeks, and people noticed that. One day he told one of his friends that he was going out to the shops, and his friend said to me, but he never came back. And we know that he went down to the river, and some of his personal items and clothes were found on the banks of the river, and later, sadly, his body was recovered. Some people fear, especially those who knew him, that he took his own life, although we'll have to wait formally for the coroner to rule on that. But that had a huge impact on the local community. There was also another young man from Afghanistan who was in a neighbouring hotel. He had had some issues with the Home Office. He had told a couple of people who worked with him that he felt like they just weren't believing his story. He left his hotel in the early hours of the morning and he was found on the hard shoulder of the motorway. His friends feel that he had walked into the traffic. He suffered huge head injuries and later he died in hospital. And the Afghan community here all came together and they had a huge fundraiser for him and they paid for his body to be repatriated back to Afghanistan. And one of them said to me that, he'd come here, he had fled the Taliban. He had come here for sanctuary and safety, but in the end they ended up his body being repatriated back to the very place that he had fled from.
So Darshna, a lot of this story is obviously about what's going on in these local communities and the asylum backlog. And Rishi Sunak has said that he's going to try and deal with this asylum backlog. He's also said he's going to stop the boats as well. Last week, it was announced that the UK's net migration figures had reached a record high. According to the Office for National Statistics, immigration had led to the UK's population increasing by 606,000 last year. However, that was fueled in part by Ukrainian refugees, Hong Kong visas, and the government's own schemes to encourage workers and international students to the UK. And whilst Rishi Sunak said net migration figures are too high, he insisted that he hadn't lost control of the immigration system. He just this week mentioned that the government has purchased 2 new barges which will house migrants, which will presumably relieve pressure on hotels and local communities. What's the sense in terms of whether that will actually help this situation in terms of the asylum backlog?
Well, the government's under huge pressure to try and stop the use of hotels, even though it's steadily been increasing under Rishi Sunak's own watch. What the government has come up with, this idea of using these giant barges. But if you think about it, there are 50,000 people stuck in hotels. The barges can hold around 1,000 people. We've heard about the BB Stockholm in Portland Port down south. That can hold slightly more than that, around 3,000. it's going to be a very small dent in the numbers who are stuck in hotels at the minute, and it might not apply to existing residents. It might only apply to new arrivals. So you have to question how much of a difference it's going to make. Legally, what's going to happen, because a lot of these places are putting up legal challenges, like the local council, for example. There's huge opposition. We've seen opposition to hotels, but there's also opposition to the use of things like these giant barges on all sorts of different reasons. Some local communities are saying it's not appropriate. Some human rights groups are saying, imagine being stuck on a barge for all that time, and the small rooms, the small cabins that they'll be housed in. So for lots of different reasons, again, people are objecting. So we'll have to see whether we actually start to see asylum seekers moved into them. Because there have been other places. There was a place up in Yorkshire called Linton-on-Ouse where the government had planned to use an old RAF base, but there was a huge amount of opposition to that. And then the Home Office quietly shelved those plans. So we'll have to see whether they actually go ahead, although Rishi Sunak said he is determined to go ahead.
And he also has his flagship illegal migration bill coming up as well. That's facing a lot of criticism in the House of Lords and elsewhere. How does that fit into this picture?
Well, he's getting pressure because he has pledged to stop the boats. And it's a huge issue, not just amongst the opposition, people across the country, but within his own party, he's under pressure. So some Tory MPs feel that it's not harsh enough. Some people are horrified at the prospect of what he's proposing. They're worried about our international reputation and the fact that Britain has a solid reputation for always welcoming asylum seekers. What the government's proposing is that if you do come, as they say, on an illegal route, so if you come across the channel on one of these boats, they'll have the power to detain you, to deport you within 28 days to somewhere like Rwanda. And then you won't be allowed to apply to come back into Britain again. You won't be able to apply for British citizenship ever again. We've seen this done in some other countries, including America and Australia. But the fact that the government's talking about adopting it here has caused a lot of opposition.
Where do you think race plays a role here when it comes to something like Kegworth, the village, the rumours? Because some will say that it's the type of asylum seeker, given that, this country very much has, a legal route for Ukrainians to come over and they're welcomed with open arms.
What's interesting is that a lot of villagers are always very quick to say to me, I'm not racist, but these are my concerns. I don't want to be portrayed as racist. That was a huge concern of a lot of the protesters. They all kept saying, we keep getting accused of being racist. They kept saying, we are just local villagers. We're just concerned parents. We're just concerned residents. What's interesting is that the far-right group, Patriotic Alternative, they've been holding a lot of protests locally. And for them, they have openly mentioned things like the fact that a lot of asylum seekers are Muslim, that they aren't white British, that they're opposed to migrants coming here who aren't white British. We've seen them now attending one of the protests in Kegworth and bringing some of these politics into it. A lot of comparisons have been made with the Ukrainian scheme. So one lady actually said to me, I asked her about the Ukrainian scheme, and she said it would be different if they were from Ukraine. And I was trying to push her on why it would be different. And she said, they're from a different culture. They're not the same as us. They don't share the same values. And she has pointed out, a lot of people have said to me very subtle things like they don't believe in our way of life, or they've got different values to us. And it's the same kind of language that we've heard from some within government. So we've heard the Home Secretary refer to cultural differences, for example.
Darshna Soni, thank you very much for talking to me. Thank you.
Thank you.